Harlem was used to threats, used to tension, used to adults testing limits and living with the consequences. But that year, something happened that crossed a boundary everyone understood instinctively, even if it was never written down. A child was threatened, not as part of a larger war, not during a public clash, just one reckless act that violated the one line the streets still treated as absolute. The reaction was immediate, not panic, not chaos, recognition. Because when a child is pulled into street business, every other rule becomes irrelevant. Power struggles pause. Alliances stop mattering. The question is no longer who's right or who's strong. It's who allowed the line to be crossed. And that question led straight to Bumpy Johnson. What followed wasn't a public display. There were no speeches, no warnings passed through intermediaries, no visible escalation. But within hours, the atmosphere shifted. Certain spaces closed. Certain people stopped showing up. Conversations ended before they began. Harlem didn't wait to be told what the response would be. It anticipated it. That anticipation is what made 1954 different. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making an example. It was about closing a door permanently. And the way that door was closed reshaped how the streets operated long after the moment itself was gone. 1954 isn't remembered for what happened to the child. It's remembered for what never happened again. Because sometimes one reaction is enough to redraw the street code. And once that code changes, it doesn't need to be enforced twice. In Harlem, there were many lines that could be tested. Territory, money, reputation, even authority itself. But children were not one of them. That boundary wasn't enforced by fear or written codes. It was enforced by consensus. Everyone understood that once a child was dragged into street business, the entire environment became unstable. That's why the threat in 1954 didn't register as a minor incident. It registered as a system failure. When adults threaten each other, the consequences stay contained. When a child is threatened, consequences spread. Parents react. Neighbors intervene. Witnesses stop staying silent. Police attention becomes unavoidable. One reckless act has the potential to expose everyone. Harlem understood that instinctively. So the question wasn't who did it. It was how fast the line would be restored. This is where Bumpy Johnson mattered. Not because he controlled every corner, but because he represented the last authority people trusted to close situations without multiplying them. His role in moments like this wasn't to punish for spectacle. It was to reestablish a boundary so clearly that no one would dare test it again. Threatening a child didn't just violate morality. It threatened predictability. And predictability is the currency that keeps street systems from collapsing into chaos. Without it, everyone becomes nervous, and nervous systems make mistakes. That's why the reaction had to be decisive but contained. Loud responses invite escalation. Slow responses invite repetition. The only effective response was one that made the behavior instantly unprofitable, socially, strategically, and reputationally. People in Harlem didn't wait to see what would happen. They began adjusting immediately. Conversations shifted. Certain individuals found themselves quietly excluded from spaces they used to move through freely. Not because orders were issued, but because no one wanted to be associated with someone who had crossed that line. This is how real enforcement works in tight systems. Isolation comes before punishment. Once isolation sets in, the outcome is already decided. The child wasn't harmed, but the threat itself was enough to force a reset. It reminded everyone that some lines aren't enforced by law or fear. They're enforced by collective survival instinct. And when that instinct activates, it doesn't ask permission. By the time the situation settled, the rule had been restored more firmly than before. Not because anyone celebrated the response, but because everyone understood the cost of letting it slide. That's why threatening a child didn't just provoke a reaction in 1954. It changed the rules. By proving that some boundaries, once violated, trigger consequences so total that no one ever wants to be near that edge again. What mattered most in 1954 wasn't how long the response took. It was how little discussion preceded it. Bumpy Johnson didn't convene anyone. He didn't gather opinions. He didn't wait for confirmation to circulate. In moments like this, delay creates doubt, and doubt invites people to test the boundary again. Instead, he closed the space. That phrase mattered on the street. Closing the space didn't mean targeting a person directly. It meant removing the conditions that allowed the behavior to exist in the first place. Access disappeared. Familiar corners went cold. Conversations that once happened freely stopped happening altogether. The environment itself became unwelcoming to the kind of behavior that had crossed the line. This approach did two things at once. First, it avoided spectacle. There was nothing for outsiders to point at, nothing for rivals to exploit, nothing for law enforcement to react to. The response didn't escalate the situation. It ended it, and endings are far more powerful than warnings. Second, it shifted responsibility. The focus was no longer on who had made the threat. It was on the behavior itself. Anyone associated with it felt the consequences immediately, not because they were punished, but because they were excluded. And exclusion spreads faster than fear. People distance themselves before they're asked to. That's why no questions were asked. Questions imply negotiation. Negotiation implies flexibility. And flexibility is exactly what you can't afford when a line involving children has been crossed. The response had to communicate one thing clearly. There would be no path back to normalcy for anyone who touched that edge. The street understood the message instantly, not because it was explained, but because it was felt. When familiar routines break overnight, people don't need clarification. They know something fundamental has changed. This is where many responses fail. They aim at deterrence and end up creating attention. Bumpy's reaction aimed at containment. By collapsing the social space around the behavior, he made repetition impossible without isolating oneself completely. No threats were issued, no warnings circulated, yet the behavior vanished. Closing the space didn't just solve the immediate problem. It reasserted a hierarchy of values that everyone recognized. Power disputes could continue. Territory could be argued over. But children were now explicitly outside the game again. Not as a moral suggestion, but as a practical certainty. That's why the response worked. It didn't rely on memory or fear. It relied on immediate environmental change. And once people experienced that change, the lesson didn't need reinforcement. The space stayed closed. What happened next was the clearest proof that the response had landed. No messenger went out. No warning was repeated. Yet the street began to self-correct almost immediately. People didn't wait to be told what the new posture was. They inferred it. That's how deeply understood the boundary was. Within a short time, familiar faces stopped appearing in certain places. Not because they were chased out, but because being present suddenly carried risk by association. Routes shifted slightly. Conversations moved indoors or stopped altogether. Individuals who had nothing to do with the original threat still adjusted their behavior, simply to avoid proximity to the wrong interpretation. This is the moment where power stops looking like command and starts looking like gravity. No one needed confirmation from Bumpy Johnson. Acting too soon, or too confidently, would have signaled misunderstanding. And misunderstanding is dangerous in environments that rely on shared signals more than explicit rules. So people slowed themselves down. They watched who hesitated and who didn't. Alignment became visible through absence, not presence. What's important here is that the adjustment wasn't chaotic. There was no scramble, no panic. It was orderly, almost procedural. That tells you the response had reactivated something familiar. The street wasn't learning a new rule. It was returning to an old one that had briefly been ignored. By the time anyone could have objected, the environment had already changed. That's the advantage of unspoken enforcement. Resistance requires coordination, and coordination requires time. But when a system realigns faster than resistance can organize, opposition never becomes visible. People didn't ask what the consequence would be if the line was crossed again. They already knew. Not in detail, in direction. They knew where that road led, and no one wanted to be seen heading that way. This kind of adjustment is what law enforcement rarely witnesses directly. It happens below the threshold of reportable events. Nothing triggers a call. Nothing justifies intervention. But behavior changes, and it stays changed. By the end of that phase, the threat no longer mattered. The person who made it no longer mattered either. The only thing that mattered was that the street had reaffirmed its limit without needing further input. That's when you know a response has worked. Not when people talk about it, but when they quietly reorganize themselves so it never needs to happen again. What stood out most after the adjustment wasn't who spoke up. It was who didn't. In a neighborhood where alliances are fluid and interests often clash, you would expect someone to argue context, to soften the story, to claim misunderstanding. None of that happened. The silence was unanimous. That silence had a reason. Defending the threat would have meant defending the behavior, not the person. And once a child is involved, behavior becomes indefensible regardless of affiliation. Any attempt to justify it would have instantly marked the speaker as unreliable, someone willing to endanger everyone else's stability for a short-term advantage. In street ecosystems, that kind of reputation is fatal. Even people who had something to lose chose distance over loyalty. The reaction created a simple calculus: stand near the behavior and be isolated, or step away and remain part of the system. No enforcement was needed because the choice was obvious. And when choices are obvious, compliance doesn't look like obedience. It looks like common sense. This is where Bumpy Johnson's influence showed its depth. He didn't need to convince anyone that defending the threat was wrong. Everyone already knew. His response simply activated that knowledge and removed any ambiguity about consequences. What's important is that the consequences weren't violent or theatrical. They were structural. Access narrowed. Trust evaporated. Familiar doors stopped opening. People who might have been neutral suddenly had to decide where they stood, and neutrality around that line was no longer an option. In tight systems, social penalties travel faster than physical ones. You can recover from confrontation. You can't recover from being quietly written out. That's why no one tried to frame the incident differently or downplay it. Doing so would have signaled willingness to cross the same line, or worse, tolerance for others crossing it. Law enforcement noticed this too. The lack of competing narratives made the situation unusually stable. No counter-rumors, no claims of overreaction, no attempts to provoke a second incident to test the boundary. The absence of defense told police everything they needed to know. The rule had been accepted across the board. That acceptance mattered more than fear. Fear fades. Acceptance hardens. By the time the situation fully settled, the question of blame had become irrelevant. The street wasn't interested in who had been wrong. It was interested in ensuring the condition that allowed the threat never returned. And once that goal became shared, defending the original act stopped being an option anyone could afford. That's why the threat ended, not with retaliation, but with consensus. A consensus so strong that speaking against it would have placed someone permanently outside the system they depended on to survive. What followed in the weeks after 1954 was not escalation, but absence. The kind of absence that only appears when a rule has fully taken hold. No second incident. No retaliation cycle. No reminder needed. The street didn't wait to see if enforcement would repeat itself. It acted as if repetition was unnecessary. That's how you know a boundary has become untouchable. People adjusted their behavior preemptively. Conversations stopped short of certain topics. Disputes were rerouted before they reached families. Anyone whose actions might even resemble a threat involving a child found themselves quietly pushed out of shared spaces, not confronted, not warned, simply excluded. The cost of proximity had become too high. This is where Bumpy Johnson's reaction revealed its long-term effect. He didn't create a rule that depended on him being present. He created a condition that made violation self-defeating. Once that condition existed, enforcement decentralized. Everyone enforced it by protecting their own position. Law enforcement observed the outcome without needing to intervene. Calls didn't spike. Tensions didn't flare. The environment stabilized in a way that felt deliberate, even though no official action had occurred. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened. From the inside, Everyone knew exactly why nothing was happening. That's the power of an untouchable rule. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need reinforcement. It exists as a shared understanding that crossing the line would isolate you instantly, not just from protection, but from participation. And in systems built on access and trust, isolation is terminal. The most telling sign was how quickly the memory hardened. Newcomers were corrected without explanation. Older figures didn't reminisce. They assumed compliance. The rule wasn't discussed because discussing it implied uncertainty, and uncertainty had been removed. By the end of that year, the boundary involving children wasn't just respected. It was invisible. People navigated around it the way they navigate around a wall that's always been there. You don't touch it, you don't test it, you don't talk about it. You plan around it. That's when a reaction stops being a response and becomes structure. 1954 didn't produce a legend because of what was done. It produced a legacy because of what no one ever tried again. And once a rule reaches that level, once it becomes untouchable, it no longer belongs to the person who established it. It belongs to the street. 1954 wasn't remembered for a dramatic punishment or a public warning. It was remembered for how quickly the possibility disappeared. After that day, no one tested the boundary again. Not because they were afraid of retaliation, but because the cost of crossing it had become absolute. Bumpy Johnson didn't create fear in that moment. He created clarity, and clarity is far more durable than intimidation. By responding in a way that closed the space immediately, he turned a reckless act into a lesson the entire street absorbed at once. The most important outcome wasn't what happened next. It was what never happened again. Children stopped being used as leverage. Threats stopped being framed in ways that touched families. Disputes rerouted before they reached that edge. The street didn't wait for enforcement. It enforced the rule itself, quietly, consistently, and without needing reminders. That's how power reshapes an environment without expanding violence. It doesn't add rules. It removes options. Once an option becomes socially impossible, it no longer needs to be policed. 1954 proved something fundamental about how street codes evolve. They don't harden through repeated punishment. They harden through one reaction that leaves no ambiguity. After that, memory does the work. The line that was crossed that year didn't lead to chaos. It led to a reset. And once that reset took hold, Harlem didn't need another example. The message had already settled into the pavement, the routines, and the silence that followed. That's why 1954 stands apart, not as a story of force, but as the moment the street decided collectively that some lines would never be crossed again.